Welcome and good morning to our esteemed panelists and audiences on the West Coast and East Coast, and namaste around the world. I'm Angela Chitkara, and I'm honored to be moderating this year's session at the Global Milken Conference in LA, titled Charting India's Emergence, Prosperous or Precarious? We'll find out. Quick note, we encourage all of you to use the QR code on the screen to pose questions to our panelists. Thank you. Panelists, you all observed the India story unfolding over the past several decades. It is the most populous country on the planet, with 1.4 billion people, with a growing middle class and consumers. More than 50% of its population are below the age of 25, and more than 65% are below the age of 35. Meanwhile, investors and multinationals have gone from being risk-averse to being fully vested in the India market. Even one of the biggest India skeptics, investor Jim Rogers, is now in support of the India growth story. So what is the India story and how has it evolved? U.S. Ambassador to India and former Mayor of LA, Eric Garcetti, congratulations on completing your first year in India. What have been your observations? And by the way, he's very active in social and digital media, so you may want to follow him.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's so nice to be here at Milken. Welcome. Hey, Kathleen. I had visitors who've come to LA who have visited for the last 12 months, and it's been actually a wonderful bridge between Los Angeles and India. But whether you're American, whether you're part of the global audience that's here, that comes to Milken every year, it's really an extraordinary moment when we say precarious or prosperous. I would really describe India right now as one of, if not the centers of the world. A place where the dynamism of the economy, the youth and the optimism of the population, and the raw opportunities and energy is almost unmatched in the world. And let me just kind of put a couple points out there. One, the whole world feels divided, at war, in conflict, politically unsure of itself. Then you go to India and it's like a different universe. It's a place where I often describe to Americans what we used to describe as the American dream, that kind of, it didn't matter where you came from, who your parents were, what language they speak, how they worship God, the geography you come from. What really mattered was the dreams that you had and how hard you were willing to try to make them come true. That's India today. It's a place where, with a young population, and as I said on the stage when we kicked off this conference on Sunday, the population of Indians who are 15 years and younger is equal to the population of the United States of America. When China's population is projected to decline, India's will expand by 200 or 300 million more on top of what it is today. So one investor told me, you know what the next big India is? It's India again. And it's a place where none of us can afford politically, socially, culturally, educationally, financially, economically, to not know. And so part of my mission as this bridge between the two largest democracies in the world is A, to get Americans much more fluent on India and Indians, because India and Indians know America and Americans so much better because of decades of immigration, contributions, engagement, but also to look at a pathway in which two democracies might guide those defining technologies and values, create a strategic partnership to kind of enforce the peace that hopefully will have a prosperous future. In fact, my 4 Ps that I always talk about as ambassador are peace, prosperity, planet, and people. And it's not the US plus India. I'll give you some examples later, but it's really a multiplicative relationship of the US times India when we get that together.
Thank you, Ambassador. Harshal?
Yeah, sure. I'll add one more P to your Ps. And I don't think India is precarious at all. I think it is on a way to prosperity. But what it really has today, I think, is potential, right? And that's where we as an investor, that's what we're looking at. As an investor, we're always looking at sort of what's coming, what's the forward-looking earnings of any company, and that's what we're looking at. What's the forward-looking growth of India? And then to me, that comes in 3 big kind of areas, right? One is the demographic dividend that we all talked about, right? It serves all the 1.4 billion people in India, serves one from the supply side as a strong educated workforce, right? But also the rising middle class serves provides the demand side of the equation as well, right? So both of those sides are taken care of. The second piece is a very reform-minded government there today, and the amount and the types of things they've done from infrastructure development, talk about roads going, 1.5 times, airports have been doubled, right? 75 new airports have been built in the last 10 years. The digital infrastructure that we all, talk about, and the about $260 billion worth of transactions happening digitally every month in India, right? So all of that momentum that the government infrastructure has created, I would say, is kind of another kind of a launch point, right? And then the third, when you look at the private sector, it's a very vibrant startup ecosystem in India. Not just that, even on the corporate side, I would say the balance sheets are very delevered right now. The capacity utilization is at 75%. So we are looking at a very strong investment cycle in India going forward as well, right? So you put all of those three things together, and you say, this is like the unprecedented sort of a structural growth story that we have in front of us, and it's very unique. It's by itself, right? People talk about India as China plus one. The India story is not China plus one. India story is India plus zero.
Right. Thank you, Radhika.
So I've seen India in two capacities. My father was on the other side of Eric. He was Indian ambassador to multiple countries in the 1970s. And I promise you the India story was not a great story to tell in the 70s. So when I hear Eric talk about it, it fills me with a tremendous sense of pride. And now as someone who is a manager of public money, I think the India story is 500 years of history coming to its own. If you look at India 500 years ago, we were about 30% of world economic output. We had our tryst with colonialism, and perhaps the first 40 years, the country got political independence, but struggled with economic independence because we had chosen, for multiple reasons, a PSU and government-dominated model of growth. And I think the India story really started to find its footing in the early 80s and 90s. What you see of the India story feels like this time it's different. But interestingly, the Indian economy has actually doubled every 6 years since the 1980s. If you go back and look at economic data, since the 1980s, every 6 years, the Indian economy has doubled. The reason it feels different now is, one, the doubling is happening at scale because 4 trillion is not a small number. And the second is, as Eric said, India is almost an oasis with so much happening in the world. And I would highlight just 4 parts that define the Indian story. One is demographics that I think both Eric and Harshal have talked about. And in the whole Milken conference, I've heard the demographic challenges that so many other parts of the world are facing. 70% of the population being young is very unique. The second is the animal spirits of the private sector. Indians are fundamentally entrepreneurs. And that spirit of entrepreneurship, whether it starts as a person who's building a business on Shark Tank India, where I happen to be a judge, to someone listing a business on the National Stock Exchange, and now having both the idea and capital to back those ideas. So the spirit of entrepreneurship that defines India. The third is policy. You used to joke about the Indian cricket team that we had the habit of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. And I think that cycle is reversed.
Only against the Australians.
Oh, yeah. And the British sometimes. Yeah. But I think now policy is in sync with what the private sector wants. It could be digital public infrastructure. It could be physical infrastructure, airports, roads, highways. It could be policies that promote Indian manufacturing. It could be the rise of the creator economy, but it's a policy regime that is doing what the private sector wants and is not delivering any negative surprises, which in my view is a big deal in India. And the fourth, I think, which is the greatest one, is the confidence of the average Indian. It reflects in the confidence to spend. It reflects in the confidence to take risk in building business. It reflects in consumer confidence. So it's a confluence of these 4 things coming together and coming together at scale.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Asha.
Yep. So So first of all, my co-panelists have done such a fabulous job of speaking about what's happening on the ground, what the opportunities are, and things like that. So I would like to zoom out a little bit, zoom up a bit more. From a 30,000-foot view, I feel that with the revolution that's coming up right now on AI, I feel that intelligence, excuse me, global intelligence is arising as sort of a unified entity now, just like the internet. And this intelligence
Can I give you some more?
has imperatives of its own. Excuse me. It has imperatives of its own. And I think in that global intelligence network, the imperatives of peace, of prosperity, of unity are things that are absolutely something that the planet wants. I think these are things that we will need to flow with as nation states, as companies, as giant companies that are already there, which are sort of bigger than nation states now. So the Googles of the world or the Apples of the world are going to have to rise to that place and flow with this intelligence. And in that imperative, in that global imperative, what's critical to me is that nations that value, that are joined at the hip with a value system of unification, of peace, of prosperity, and of abundance, will have to come together, and they'll have to be working together as entities which will propel, which flow with this flow of sort of hyper-intelligence, hyper-connected global world of our own. And India and US are both waking up as free societies, as free democratic societies that value each individual and that still have a sort of, they understand the critical value of the human being, of the intelligence of one human being and of individual power. I think what's going to happen is that these two societies, American and Indian, because of its value system of freedom and individual rights and of peace, are likely to rise together and work together. Where does it take us as individual venture? I'm in venture capital. Where does it take us? I feel that my role is getting defined by this flow of destiny and history. And my role, I see myself right now playing, in fact, I'm already doing that, playing a significant role in making sure that the obstacles to this flow are minimized. And what that means, for me, what that practically means is obstacles to, let's say, venture capital regulations. I mean, those things are going down. The regulatory system becomes more of a system that allows both our two nations, our societies, to come together on various things. And I don't know when do you want me to speak about ISET right now or later?
Well, we're going to get to it in just a minute.
We can come back.
We're just going to get to it in just a minute.
Yeah, I can talk about ISET later.
Thank you, Asha. Srini.
Yeah, it's a tough act coming back
what is
after
the India
so many
story
people
for you?
speaking about India. But in the context of the fact that not many people may be fully familiar with the background, and I'll address some of the typical questions that I get when I go to investors as a matter of background. The first 16 years, I was a banker in a joint venture with Goldman. I was raising capital for Indian companies. We are a perennially capital short country. And the last 15 years, we built a investment management business, which is about $9 billion of capital, mostly with global institutional investors. I just want to sort of put the economic situation today in context. I'll pick three dates: 1947, 1991, and 2014. 47 was the independence, and as she mentioned earlier, we got political independence, but not economic independence. 1991 is when we nearly went bankrupt as a country, and we had to pledge our gold reserves to meet our financial obligations. And we were forced to open up the economy. And 1994 was the first time when global institutional investors got access to our stock market, which, by the way, is actually one of the oldest stock markets in the world. It's more than 120 years old. And today, cut to 2014. So between the first 44 years, economic independence, no political independence. The next 33 years, confused, cacophonic, and political establishment with coalition governments. So there was not real good policy making. It would be, I would call it 2 steps forward and 1 step backwards, but still it's 1 step forward. And that's why, as Radhika mentioned, the economy continued to double every 6 years. 2014 was an inflection point when the new government came in with a single party mandate. And that's very important to understand because decision making then becomes easier. And in the last 10 years, all the stuff that Harshal talked about in terms of the way the policy has been shaped to enable a confident India, enable the entrepreneurs to build businesses, enable capital to take risks. And those are important indicators for people to sort of look at India as a long-term potential investment opportunity. And one of the other things that I get questions all the time from institutional investors is that, is there a policy flip-flop in India? I can tell you one thing. We've had probably 16 governments between the period of 1991 and 2014 of different hues and colors, different political leanings, different political ideologies, but no government has ever reversed an economic policy of the previous government. And that's very important to understand from a consistency of policy point of view. And the second thing is that insofar as, many people ask me, it's tough to invest in India. It's like Hotel California. You can check in anytime you like. You can never get out. But that is also not true. I think unlike China, for example, where your ability to take money out of the country depends upon the whims and fancy of a particular regulator. There has never been such regulations in India. If you are a public market investor in India, and since 1994, there has never been a single instance where a foreign investor wanted to exit and was unable to exit because the regulations did not permit them to exit. And this is very, very important for people to understand that policies are followed. There are obviously kinks in the system. We'll come to that in a minute. I'm sure we'll have time to discuss that. And so policy point of view, consistency is absolutely critical. And I think the governments across political spectrum have been able to do that. And this government has just taken it to the next level. And we believe that, and we're, just in case, we're still having a small election in India as well. And if this government, if the pollsters were to say that, believed this government may come back to power in June, and if that happens, to my mind, I think that could be possibly the second inflection point in terms of global investors coming into India.
Thank you very much, Srini. I find that it was very important for us to establish what the India story is from your perspectives, because it's a question that investors often ask. What is the India story? So very quickly, so what are some myths about the India market or legacy issues that exist for those considering investing in the India market? How is it different from other emerging markets? And we're just going to go through this rather quickly. Radhika, as India's only female CEO of a major asset managing company at Edelweiss, what are your thoughts?
I'm going to focus on one issue. We manage about $15 billion of public equity and fixed income money. And one of the long-standing myths about India is that it has been a market that has been dominated by foreign capital. And it is a market where investment opportunities and liquidity is limited. And I just want to take 2 minutes to address that. If you look at foreign investors, they've been an important part of our markets. But what has happened in the last 10 years is there's a rising structural trend for local investors, and that reflects our consumer confidence to add capital to Indian markets. I represent the mutual fund industry, which is retail capital in India, and today we have almost a $3 billion monthly flow coming into Indian equity markets of small savings. And this is without any 401k advantages or tax advantages accorded to small savings. They are called systematic investment plans for the Indian saver. Today, foreign ownership of Indian equity markets is at about 16%. Indian ownership, combined mutual funds, insurance, and domestic institutions is at about 17%, of which mutual funds are 11%. And what this has done to the Indian market is it's almost given a Teflon coating. So our ability to fall, particularly when there are global crises. You saw Russia, Ukraine, you saw what happened in the Middle East, you saw COVID. The Indian market has become far less volatile because of the support of domestic capital. And we do believe, like China went through, India is going through a major financialization movement. So this $3 billion of capital, if I were to reckon a guess, 4 or 5 years later, should be about $5 to $6 billion of monthly capital coming into Indian capital markets from domestic investors. The other point I would make is that the universe from a global investor point of view of Indian companies to invest into has widened. Today there are 500 companies with over $1 billion in market cap. We have one of the most liquid single stock futures market in the world. And even from an investor point of view, historically Indian global investors used to look at India as perhaps the top 100 companies. I would say that universe has expanded easily to the top 250 to 300 companies. What you call a mid-cap company in India is now about $5 billion in market cap. So the investment universe and stability of the Indian public markets has changed tremendously. And I think that's a myth that needs to be corrected.
Thank you, Radhika. Ambassador?
So, you know, I'm a diplomat, not an investor, so as I've said a couple days ago, take all this advice for every penny it's worth. But you do pay, at least the Americans here, do pay my salary, and we spend a lot of time, I'm here with Audrey Slover, who's part of our economic section at the embassy, really assisting this incredible tidal wave of investors, of financiers, and of American companies right now that are trying to figure out that very question. And I think the most important thing to remember is India isn't a market. It is a series of markets, just like India, while technically a country, is a series of countries. It is as wide and as diverse as the United States, then ×4 population-wise, but the history is so much longer. The return, as Radhika said, to an economy that besides a couple hundred years of an aberration has been the largest economy in the world and will be again. John Chambers predicted by 2070, give or take a decade, it will be the #1 economy in the world. Not everybody focused on when it's going to become #4 or when it's going to become #3, #2. You begin to see that this is at once both a long play, and you have to then try to freeze different geographies and different moments to figure out where you want to put your money. I would say right now infrastructure is really what is fueling the economy in India. $100 billion last year plus. The rate now for airports is 15 major airports a year, so more than one a month. I've been to 22 of the 36 states and territories. And I'll go back 2 months later to a place I just was, and there's a brand new airport there that just kind of came up out of nowhere. They're being built, something to inspire us on our infrastructure here as I work on
and they're nice airports.
LAX. They're nice, that, you know, in as few as like 15, 16 months sometimes.
Yeah.
You see that in a train system that's coming up. It's funny, USAID is involved in helping the Indian train system electrify. And I said, well, why are you asking Americans for advice on trains? But so nevertheless, we're engaged in that. You see that in ports. If you want to see the future of ports, go to an Adani port where you see not just the infrastructure of logistics in a very nice vertical column, but energy, the future fuels like green hydrogen, the largest human power plant ever built, which is a solar project right next to that port. You can see efficiencies that are also great, not just in the Indian market, but we're seeing a lot of American companies now co-venture and co-partner with Indian companies in third countries on energy, on infrastructure, on transportation, on logistics. The consumer side is slower than you would expect. Demand on the consumer side isn't growing as quickly, but I think that's going to come behind this infrastructure once it's there. And I would say the other place is the startup culture is as dynamic as any place I've ever witnessed. And I've seen this in Silicon Valley. I've certainly witnessed it here in Los Angeles. I've gone to other parts of the world. I think it's ironic that China, which was a more closed economy, communist-run country, is much more open and lower walls in terms of capital flowing in. India, which is a hyper-capitalist country at the village level, at the instinctive level, was this place that has traditionally been a much more open economy over the centuries, linked to the world, and for so long had these walls up. The walls are crumbling down, but I still think they have a lot more to crumble down to make the capital flow more smoothly. And you're right, your point, but there's always exceptions that aren't necessarily about whether you can bring capital out, like General Motors miscalculated about whether American-styled cars were what Indians want, had to close down a plant but couldn't get out of Maharashtra because of, literally, like, couldn't leave after they said, we failed, we just want to leave. They'd sold the factory to another car company, and the labor laws there wouldn't let them. So, you know, there's still stories of kind of the hangovers of the old system in India that eyes wide open you have to navigate. That's what we're here for, the embassy. If you ever want to, if you're American, certainly we can help you do that. But the last data point is it's also a two-way bridge. We're talking a lot about India.
Right.
Indian investment in the United States is the most underreported story here, I think, domestically. We have Select USA. The Commerce Department invites the world to invest in America. Last year, the biggest delegation of investors for investments in America came from India. So far, knock on wood, the #1 country in the world. Again, this year is India. That's June 23rd to 25th in Washington, D.C. Old steel plants that were about to be closed down in America being revived by Indian investment. Mines that were going to shut down. You know, hardcore industry that we've kind of moved away from in this country, as well as cutting-edge future technologies like nuclear, battery technology, electrodes, other things that are going to be part of the economy of the future. Indian capital is also flowing into America to help create jobs here, and I think that's a very interesting story, too.
It's excellent. In fact, Ambassador, that's a nice segue to our next question, and Harshal, I'm just going to get to you in a second. Why is the U.S.-India relationship considered a strategic partnership?
I call it the romantic ambiguity of our relationship. So if Facebook's status was for a long time between us, it's complicated. We're definitely dating, but India doesn't want to get married. And in political terms, to be married is to be an ally. And India, for a long time, was very proud of being non-aligned. Now, I think, is very rightfully so. They don't want to be anybody's number two. They want to be seen as a power, as an equal, as a player, and as a unique player who can almost talk to everybody in the world, with maybe one or two exceptions on the borders. But those two countries aside, really they want to be a friend to all and want to be a connector to all. So the strategic relationship is the next best thing to marriage. It's like going steady. And that is not just a term, but it's something that we're deepening militarily, which is a really huge story, considering, you know, 50 years ago, we were steaming a aircraft carrier into the Bay of Bengal that really pushed India into the Soviet Union's hands because we were trying to help our then ally Pakistan not lose the east half of its country when Bangladesh was trying to go for independence, to today where we're the #1 military exercise partner of India, where this past year we made history by GE jet engines for future generations of fighter jets, the most exquisite technology that's ever existed in this space that we haven't even given to some of our closest allies, will be brought to India and built in India, kind of solidifying that relationship for 20, 30 years of military development. You can go down the list on our intelligence sharing. We can go down the list on some of the ways we're a force for good on economic development, the digital stack that India has put forward on digital payments and digital identities. We're partnering with them in the Pacific Island countries, in Africa and Southeast Asia. So it's really truly is a strategic partnership where that multiplicative relationship I talked about, U.S. can't always do it alone, India can't do it alone. When we get together, not only can we do it, it's usually an exponential good that is coming from it.
That's great. Thank you. Harshal, as President and Chief Investments Officer at GE Asset Management, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the Ambassador laid it out perfectly well, right? And this is a strategic partnership because this is a great power partnership. You know, it's a partnership of equals in a way, right? Yep. And, you know, when you think about it, why is that so? Yeah, there may not be, to your point, you know, there's not getting married between the two countries here, but I think India shares the same values that we have, right? Which is democracy, which is a rules-based system. You know, it's human rights, all of those things. So I think that makes India a very, very good partner, right? Just from an ideological perspective, right? And then when you talk about security cooperation, we at GE, we are very, very proud of that agreement about building the F414 engines for the Hindustan Aeronautics Limited and for the Tejas light combat aircraft, right? But again, you know, when you think about that, why is that so? You know, India is the 4th largest military in the world, number 2 and number 3 being China and Russia, right? You know, India's defense budget is bigger than some of our NATO allies, right? And so, so that's where and it's also very geostrategically located in the Indian Ocean, which provides, it's very critical in providing free movement across the Indo-Pacific. So just from all of that perspective, the security cooperation is extremely important, but also the economic cooperation. There is a $200 billion bilateral trade with India and for the U.S.
Right.
When you think about some of the critical technologies that we here are looking for, right? Building semiconductor plants. The semiconductor industry is a national security issue, not just for US, but also for India. And guess where 20% of the world's VLSI engineers are, right? They are in India. So, it has to be a very, very good partnership from that perspective. Space exploration, Elon was talking about multiplanetary existence of humans yesterday. There are 45,000, people working in the space industry. 25% of them, by the way, are women. And they cost 1/10 of the what a space rocket scientist would cost here in the US. And these are the people who sent a mission on Moon for $75 million, right? That's less than what it takes to make the budget of the movie Interstellar. So so I think it's a great opportunity for the US technological lead to meet with this frugal innovation that India brings, and again, that becomes a very strong bond for that partnership. I think the last thing I would say is when we talk about kind of driving global change, India is again a very, very good partner for doing that from a global governance perspective, right? When we are thinking about climate change, the road to net zero has to go through India. We cannot achieve it without their support, and so that's very, very, very important for that as well. And I would say, when we are trying to build this world that is getting very, very multipolar, if we have to win the hearts and minds of the global South, I think again India and US, together provide a very, very different proposition than the alternative that is available.
It's an excellent point. Asha, your role as a VC and philanthropist, why do you consider the US-India partnership a strategic one?
So there used to be a time when we did not have sort of the government blessings. We as venture capitalists used to leave from Silicon Valley. I'm based in Palo Alto, California. We used to go from Silicon Valley, go to India, look at the sort of the startup world, which is, of course, it used to be a very very healthy and a very prolific startup world, just like Israel. So we used to go there independently. We just sort of looking at startups in different fields and so on. What has changed actually since 2014, 2015? And especially recently after Prime Minister Modi's trip here, is that he and President Biden have signed off on something called ISET, which is sort of still in the clouds. It is still something that people are working the contours of. But ISET kind of initiatives, which are sort of symbolic blessings by both governments on things like semiconductors, AI, quantum, wireless communications, and so on. These things are basically now becoming avenues where, as venture capitalists, if we invest, there is significant support coming in from the governments. And the reason I'm assuming, right, and probably Eric knows this better than I do, but I think the reason this is happening is because US and India are realizing as geopolitical partners now that this is of strategic importance. This is not just about our companies doing well and creating nice unicorns which can go public and so on. This is much more. It's sort of an imperative which is a power imperative now. It's an imperative on crafted by both the nation states as a direction where the government is fully behind us. So I think if those of us who are in venture capital or even in impact investing like I do also from our family foundation, is that if we can play an active role in helping the government deregulate some of the sort of the bottlenecks on where this collaboration is heading, I think that's a very important, very productive role that we could be playing as people who can help reduce some of the regulatory barriers. There used to be 6,000 barriers to starting a company once upon a time. It's now come down to about 2,000, thankfully, because of a very business-friendly, proactive Modi government. But I think we still have long ways to go before we can get to a place where we have Silicon Valley-like ease of doing business. So that's where I see this. So things like ISET and E2 and these various initiatives that are in the pipeline are great, but would they actually translate into significant public support, public fund support? That I'm not sure, but maybe Eric can handle that a little bit later.
All right, thank you, thank you. So we're in a room full of investors of all sizes wanting to know, is India an alternative or complement to China? There's also significant cross-border investment. Let's discuss the shift in areas of supply chains, chip manufacturing, joint initiatives on defense, and regional cooperation, which we sort of touched on. Srini.
Well, I think, first of all, it's from a capital flow point of view, investors have started looking at India because of whatever has happened in China. I think that is a fallout of what the geopolitics of what it is today. Having said that, as investors who've been sort of raising capital and investing in India, that was never a factor for us. It only makes the difference in terms of the amount of capital that we can attract, given the fact that there is probably more airtime available for people like us. I think the important point that investors need to understand in the current context is that there is a government policy and a clear policy with regard to getting them to invest in certain specific areas where it's a priority for the government. And it's a two-way street. And as Asha mentioned earlier, for example, if you take the startup ecosystem in India, the startup ecosystem is very vibrant in defense, in space, in healthcare, for example. I'll give you a couple of examples of the kind of things that India can deliver to the rest of the world. The CAR T-cell therapy, for example, with the first commercially approved CAR T-cell therapy in India, is available at about $20,000. Compare that to the US, which is about close to $500,000. And this is already an approved commercially available CAR T-cell therapy in India. It's a portfolio company of ours. Let me give you an example of diagnostics for breast cancer, for example. India has only 3,500 machines to actually diagnose breast cancer in the conventional way. So it's a team that came out of IBM and Canon and a bunch of women, actually, who created this handheld device using low power, no physical examination, and no invasion of privacy. And they've trained the AI to read the thermal signals of the breast cancer cells. So you can imagine in a society which is very, very conservative, where people were not even going to the doctors to just get themselves diagnosed in the first place, and to have this kind of thing where there is nobody in the room. The woman is sitting in front of a laptop, the doctor is sitting outside, and he's just telling her to turn right, left, and he's getting the thermal images. And this is available. This is recently approved by the US FDA to be introduced here in the US. So there is a whole bunch of things that's, that India can deliver in terms of what we can do on a frugal innovation basis that Harshal mentioned. On the other hand, from an investor point of view, to make significant returns, obviously some of these early stage investments and across these sectors are interesting in investment opportunities, and there is no restriction in terms of the amount of foreign investment that can be used up. Just to give you a statistical number, last year about $50 billion of capital came into the private equity industry, and to add to the point in terms of exits, $25 billion was actually exited between the public markets and the private markets. So it's not as if it's a one-way street. So it works. To my mind, the collaboration between India and the US across some of these strategic sectors is going to make a huge difference going forward in terms of cementing the relationship between the two nations.
Thank you, Srini. Radhika?
So, your question was, is India another China? It is, I would agree with Srini, we are benefiting from what is going on in China. But I think the India story is not the China story of 15 years ago. There may be a similarity in demographics, but as investors, perhaps it is closer to the US story of the late 1980s. The focus on building a domestic economy, the focus on demography. And I think for many years, investors have looked at India as one of many emerging markets. I think that thesis needs to change. We are 18% of the MSCI India. we are only 1.5% of global benchmarks, even though the economy is 4-5% of world output. So India is reasonably under-owned, whether in its capacity as an emerging market or standalone. I think one of the important things you mentioned around supply chain is there is a larger trend in thrust towards indigenization and being, the word in Hindi is Atmanirbhar, but self-dependent. And that focus on self-dependency, and I think this narrative got very powerful in COVID, is evident in semiconductors, it's evident in electronic manufacturing, it's evident in defense. So if I build on the example of defense, I think 5-6 years ago, India would have ranked about 10th or 11th among top importers of defense goods. Today, we've turned net defense exporter. We've exported $3 billion of defense goods in the last year, with the projection that that probably will be closer to $5 billion. I think that is where a partnership with US, with the rest of the Quad, is very, very powerful. There have been specific policies targeted to ensure that defense purchases are targeted at Indian manufacturers of defense, largely state-owned companies. So in last year's defense budget, about 75% of procurement was targeted at defense, local defense, and we export to 80 different countries as far as defense equipment. A similar story is playing out in a sector like electronics manufacturing. Of course, India is a large consumer of electronics, and that market is only going to expand. But the components of electronics equipment, India has gone from being about 2% of global electronic manufacturing to about 6-7%, and that number could easily expand to 8 to 10%. So there's a focus in India about indigenization of the economy. You know, you mentioned, Eric, Adani, but I often visit as a public markets investor multiple different plants and factories in India. And when you talk to business owners and entrepreneurs, there is a realization that today, yes, we're importing chips from China, we're doing assembly in India, but we are making progress up the value chain. And the vision that a Gautam Adani has, that a Mahindra has, is that by 2030 perhaps, could all of this be done in-house? This could all be done in-house, and we have 4 or 5 years to skill our people up the value chain. And I think that is going to be a story that shapes the Indian economy over the next 4 or 5 years.
That's excellent. Thank you, Radhika. Ambassador.
Yeah, so many great points. My mind's racing. I mean, one thing, just jumping here, if you're betting against India, you're going to lose money. And if you're not betting on India, you're going to lose money. So you really need to, I think, as responsible investors, be in India. I think we, as a responsible country, we take the same metaphor, need to be continuing to invest in our relationship. Last year, Indians were the #1 source of students to the United States. A quarter, 1 out of 4 of every student in higher education from abroad coming from India. Trust me, I had to process each of those visas through, which we've reduced wait time by 75% and increased visas by 60% with the same number of people. So we're doing, you know, but we're still like treading water because those numbers are going to double-digit go up all the time. It's #1 source of adoptions. It's the largest trading partner we are to India. I mentioned military exercises. We're the #1 country in military exercises. There's so much to invest in, but you also have to understand, I think, some nuances. It's funny you called it the 1980s. It's like the 1980s in America. I'd say it's like the 1890s in America. It's, you know, when all the railroads were putting foot down, and these families had immense wealth. And the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and the Ambanis and the Adanis, and where will they put that money? How will competition come? Are they too big? You know, no, we love them because they're big and they're putting things down, but will that last forever? You know, the car companies back then in the 1890s, everybody was a startup car company, and there were dozens of them until they kind of came through. And there's that dynamism right now in India. But what's interesting, too, in the road forward, I remember being a student in college and learning the word autarky, which was, you know, countries that want to make everything themselves. And certainly India was aspiring to be autarkic with other, you know, successful experiments like Tanzania trying to do the same thing. It never quite worked back then because it was opening up your economy that allows you to actually move forward. And India still, though, has the philosophy of wanting to be self-sufficient. But what's different is in the past, self-sufficiency was about erecting barriers and trying to protect. And now I think India understands becoming self-sufficiency is actually, ironically, from liberalizing.
Yeah.
When you liberalize, you will bring in the ability to manufacture more. When you liberalize, you will see the capital flow more quickly. And that's a huge revolutionary transformation, I think, in Indian policy thinking. Now, it needs to be accelerated much more because we can brag about India's growth rate, which is the highest in the developing world and of any major economy, 7.6% last year. But to get to the 10%, then India will need to meet its job growth requirements of 1 million new jobs net a month. They won't need a China export-driven strategy, but they will need an export-supplemented strategy, in my opinion, that will give the 2 or 3% more. They will need a gender-based policy that will bring women into the workforce so that another couple percentage points potentially of growth that right now is being left on the table, where the participation of women in the paid workforce is very low, or the formal workforce is very low globally and has gone down in the last decade. So I would say the last point is, you've seen these revolutions in key places in India. The one that's, I think, missing, we've seen the digital, we've seen the physical. Now it's really, can there be the human revolution? Per capita income is still $2,400 per person. As we come down from the clouds, that's a pretty poor country on average for the persons there. The road is up, which is why they will become the #1 economy in the world when you do just the simple math. But how quickly will people move from that $2,400 to $24,000 a year? And that will come from job training. Even college graduates in India right now, only 50% of them are job ready. For semiconductors, we have the same problem in the States, but for semiconductors, there isn't the human capital yet. And so I think whatever Indian policymakers can do to really emphasize education, that's the difference with China. And the last point on China is, India's never been about China, and it isn't about China today. I think it's the wrong metaphor. The foreign direct investment that's leaving China is not coming to India, and that's because it's not liberal enough, and India is self-sufficient in its own market right now. But if the liberalization continues, it can be a +1 strategy, but India's too big to be a +1 to anyone. It is, I love what you said, it's India +0. It's big enough on its own. Everything else is gravy for the world community and the world economy if they can add the export part to that as well.
Thank you. I'm going to continue along that same vein. So what will the Indian elections mean for the country, its allies in fostering global cooperation, and multinationals that are serving and operating in the country with a significant talent pool and employee base? So let's continue with you, Ambassador, and then Harshal.
I hope you're not getting as sick of my voice as I am. I'll give you a quick analysis. All analysis points to a Modi government being reelected. By how much is kind of the over-under. He's put a very ambitious goal up. Some say it might have been too ambitious. All his ministers are stressed out to hit that number. But I don't think anybody envisages that, either in coalition at worst or straight out majority, that the Modi government and BJP won't come back. So one is stability. Two, I think, is in a third term, I think Prime Minister Modi has put a very bold goal of wanting to create the 3rd largest economy, more or less by the 100th anniversary of Indian independence in 2047. You do the calculation, it's going to be close. And it's a very arbitrary goal, but you know, we all in politics set these goals so that we can have a place to march towards. But it will be, how much will this incoming government spend its capital on deeper liberalization? I think that's the real question of the elections. And then on the social and civic side, we obviously monitor closely, but we shouldn't idealize any point of Indian history where it's been everybody holding hands and getting along any more than the history of the United States is, and we come from a place of humility. But making sure it's an inclusive economy, whether that's women, whether that's religious minorities, whether that's all regions, is I think also going to be a defining part of the post-election narrative. Is India a place that everybody belongs, that everybody feels welcome, and that their potential is most supported, so that no brilliance, no growth is left behind? And I have a lot of faith that this isn't something that governments will preach down about, but that Indians will define for themselves. And nobody can change India besides Indians. Nobody can define India's future but Indians. So instead of teaching and preaching, we can listen and learn, and then occasionally monitor and engage. Because the biggest point, I think, on democracy is, last point I'll make on this, is that we sometimes get caught up in the narcissism of small differences. Freud once wrote about that. You know that feeling, like you see this in activism in the United States. Like, you only agree with me 98% of the time, F you. Like, I'm going to fight with you about that 2% instead of my, totally different enemy who is 50% different from me. And we get caught up sometimes. I was talking to an ambassador about this. Like, let's take an autocratic country where they're having the first open LGBT meeting with an organization, and I'm reading the reports and like, wow, this is huge progress in that dictatorship that was allowed, versus a democracy where we say, oh, we're not exactly overlapping, so this narrow crescent here and this narrow crescent here is all we're going to argue about, instead of seeing things like in India that transgender rights are way advanced compared to the United States. Every state has a transgender council. They've done a census to find out who the transgender community is. There's centuries long. They face discrimination, of course, too. But it's a place where we don't always come in as the better country, and we invite criticisms ourselves. But we need democracies to engage, because democracies break each other's hearts when really we should be fighting against dictatorships. When it comes to technology, what Asha was talking about, we have technologies that will define our lives, that will either divide us and harm us, or maybe US and India together with this Critical Emerging Technologies Initiative can find technologies that connect us and protect us. And really that is the democratic values piece that I hope post-election in both of our countries, we can inspire each other to do even better.
Okay, thank you. Harshal.
I mean, a lot has been said already. It's pretty clear right now. Everybody is sort of almost never 100%, but pretty high certainty that the Modi government is coming back to power, and the market's taken that very positively, right? Because India, to your point, Eric, there's so much to be done, and there's so many unpopular decisions to be done that are unpopular today that are, better for India's long-term future. If the most popular leader in the world with the 70+% approval rating can't do it, then who can, right? And so that's what sort of, people are all very optimistic about. From a business perspective, I think, we will see, if the BJP does come to power, I think we will see the same push on infrastructure continue. We will hopefully see more kind of bilateral free trade agreements, hopefully one with the US as well, where we bring down those barriers. I also expect to see a lot more liberalization of the Indian rupee and the convertibility. I mean, there are now, 18 countries where there is INR trade settlement, right, including UAE and Japan and Singapore. I think that will probably expand. So I think the cross-border trading for the country will, I think, definitely improve based on that. The stock markets are completely pricing in the Modi victory, right? I think we should never be complacent, though. We've seen that story back in 2004, where there was a similar kind of a thought process, and there was a pretty big disappointment. I think if that happens, we could see the markets draw down 20, 30, maybe even more. I would be a buyer in that, right? Because as Srini said, if there is a new government, right, especially if there's a coalition government, it is very hard for them to reverse any of this progress that has happened. I think maybe the pace of progress will slow. But I don't think so. I think after 10 years, I think there's enough people who have seen the benefit of what's going on, and any new government, if they want to come and stay in power, I think they will have to continue on this. So again, that's not my base case, but I'll be a buyer if
Can I just add a couple of points on the social indicator point of view? When the Modi government came into power first in 2014, and his first public address after he assumed power, everybody thought there's going to be big bang announcements, etc. And in his address, the first thing he talked about was actually building toilets. And essentially, the rural homes in India did not have toilets, which actually was the worst thing for the woman in the house. And she had to go out to do her business. And if you are in a nearby jungle area, you are potentially prey for. So in mission mode, they built out the toilets across the country, and that's one of the first things that he did. And that obviously has given greater dignity to women. And in the second term, when he came into power in 2019, again, in his speech, he did not talk about economic policy. He actually talked about female infanticide. And let me just put that in context here. Unlike in the US, doctors in India are not, it is illegal to tell the sex of the child. when you go for a sonography. And so what was happening in India was that there's a strong preference for the male child, particularly in certain parts of the country, and they would kill off the female children. And that resulted in a very skewed sex ratio in large parts of highly populated parts of the country. So again, a mission mode. He talked about two things. The mode was Beti Bachao, Beti Badhao, which means save the girl child and get the girl child educated. Now, these things take time for it to actually manifest itself in terms of statistics and data. But the good news on that is that female infanticide is down, the sex ratio is up, and this is, and the indicators are, for example, even in adoption of female children, the numbers are much higher. It's almost up by 30%. So I think bringing in social change by messaging it out in the most important address that you have to the nation after assumed power is one of the hallmarks of this government. And I think if you bring 50% of the population back into the mainstream, like what this government has done, I think we're on the right path in terms of achieving what hopefully, as this government thinks, is what India's destiny is.
Thank you, Srini. We have less than 5 minutes to go before we wrap up. So I'm going to quickly just pose a question to each panelist. Radhika, this is for you. According to the IMF, India is one of the biggest adopters of AI that's solving for societal problems. It is also the first to create and adopt a digital public infrastructure, or DPI, which helps formalize the informal economy through accepting digital payments. As we know, the entrepreneurial spirit is alive and well in India, as we spoke about. How much of entrepreneurialism accounts for the formal and informal economy and the broader India investment story?
I think the India investment story is about entrepreneurship, and it is enabled by digital public infrastructure. If you look at the reason that so many small businesses, so many branded products are being created out of India, it is the contribution of digital public infrastructure and cheap data. Today, if I'm sitting in a tier 4 town in India, something like the borders of Nasik, I can set up a business, cater to 20,000 Indian PIN codes because of Amazon, because everybody in the country has cheap data, market myself on Instagram, and potentially build a business of value and list it on the exchanges.
Right.
And Angela, to me, that is the Indian dream. Digital public infrastructure plus entrepreneurship is creating jobs in tier 3, tier 4, tier 5 cities in India. That will ultimately enable the Indian dream.
Actually, they're actually creating job creators.
Yep.
They're
Rather than
creating
just
jobs
creating
and job creators. And I always say if you want to feel the India story at its most optimistic, come hang out on the sets of Shark Tank India for a day, because you will meet a guy who is in a town with 20,000 people, and 20,000 people is a small town in India. You will meet a guy who's in a town of 20,000 people who is an office boy, who has taught himself coding, teaching himself about graphic design, and is now running a business on graphic design and potentially AI, and dreams of getting funding in India and listing that business on the exchange.
May I just
Yes,
add
Asha,
to that
please go ahead.
just for a second? I want to give an example of this person that I was. So at my parents' house, there is a. There's a boy that does all kinds of other stuff, and one day I was having problems with my iPhone, and I wasn't able to stream something onto my television. So I call him and I'm like, what do we do? How do we reboot this whole thing? This guy who is absolutely uneducated, he's not gone to school ever, could actually make my iOS talk to Chromecast. He's seamlessly streaming stuff that I was getting from Netflix. I don't even know how he did it, because at that time, it was not easy to get Netflix on my iPhone. And he could do that. This is without learning English. So there is that level of intelligence and chutzpah and creativity there in India. And if only these, some of these people in that segment of society had better opportunity. I just see, yesterday somebody was calling them the lost Einsteins. I really think that they are. This gentleman was 5x smarter than me on every front. And he doesn't, he's never gone to an English, he's never gone to school.
Probably learned it on YouTube.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right.
learned it on YouTube.
Well, we
Probably learned it on
have,
YouTube.
we have less than 10 seconds left now, so this panel could go on and on. But I thank you so much to the panelists, to the audience for joining. And on a personal note, I just want to say, being the daughter of Indian immigrants and watching my parents work hard and pour everything into their kids, and see now that the future is hopeful for the next generation, I'm very encouraged. Thank you.
Thank you.